This is the FM Gold channel of All India Radio. In the program News Analysis, now we bring you a discussion on austerity measures to contain fiscal deficit. The participants are Jayanto Roy Chaudhary, The Telegraph, and Urmi Goswami, economic journalist.
The government has embarked on austerity measures which range from raising further import duties on gold to reducing non-plan expenditure. Do you think that's the right step at this current point in time?
The decision which the government, or rather the announcement which the government made last night, is more in the nature of giving a signal to the mandarins that be and the powers that be that they have to cut down on costs. By itself, these are not very significantly tightening the belt measures. If you see, asking people not to take business class but rather economic class, to reduce their travel, etc., will save the government some little amount of money, very small amounts of money, frankly speaking. Yes, the bigger component, of course, is the first item in their austerity measures list, which was that non-plan expenditure minus the recurring expenditure of salary, pension, defense, capital accounts, etc., grants to states will be cut by 10%. Now let's see what exactly is that amount. That amount is out of the 11 lakh something crore non-plan expenditure, it's about 3,88,000 crores or so. So what you want to do is you want to compress expenditure by about 39,000 crores. Much of that money will have to come from cutting subsidies. Once you cut out these key elements in your non-plan expenditure, then there is very little left for you to really cut. And that main component of that is subsidies. Giving a message that A, despite the fact that you are committed to subsidy expenditures, you want to cut expenses and much of the axe will be wielded on subsidies. And B, not so important but symbolic decisions that you have taken of not allowing 5-star hotels to be used for hosting dinners or parties of the government of India are really a message to the bureaucracy that you need to tighten your belt when you are spending public money. Now that's important as far as spending is concerned, which means don't spend more than 1/3 of your budgeted amount in the last quarter of the year. There is a tendency in ministries and departments to try and spend as much as possible in the last quarter because they don't manage to spend in the first 3 quarters or so. Secondly, don't spend more than 15% of your total budgeted amount in the last month of the year. These are measures meant to stop you from spending too much. Also to stop you from wasting your budget. Because there are unspent amounts in the budget, very often bureaucrats tend to try and push through various kinds of expenditures which may not be really necessary in the functioning of those ministries. Extraneous expenditures such as doing up the place of work, relaying marble, etc., which can actually be cut down on. So these are messages.
When we look at key programs, often because of the systems that are in place, the utilization certificate, I have to spend X amount before you can get your second tranche. It happens in most of the welfare programs. We are forced to, what happens is some amount of money gets spent in the last quarter of the year because of the structure of monitoring that we have in place. You're right, it's symbolic, but aren't we creating yet another problem? Because now, obviously, because you haven't changed the way spending happens or monitoring happens, and now you're saying follow the rules, you will create a large pool of unspent balance in many of these programs. Next year, although it will be a vote on account budget because it's election year, outlays for these programs will come down because the finance ministry, as it's wont to doing, will say, look buddy, you couldn't spend all the money I gave you, so you only get this much. So aren't we again setting ourselves up on a vicious cycle?
Yes, you're right. We are. But then, there is a system in the government. If the government wants to spend some money, it actually sees to it that the entire time frame for spending that money, for getting the monitoring checks, for getting the audit results out is compressed, and it is actually done. It means what is being said is that A, when you have a key program, when you have a flagship program, when you have something where the government really wants you to spend money, then you had better go out and do that spending and spend it wisely. But if it's something which is not so essential, then, and you have been delaying spending that in any way, then in that case, procrastinate, spend it in the next year. Don't spend it this year when it's not needed because this is the year when we want to save money.
Everybody should have known this was coming because Finance Minister had said that, look, I'm going to ensure that current account deficit is kept to 4.8% of GDP. So you knew this was coming. But is this enough? Because the current account deficit is a problem. The truth is that fiscal deficit beyond a manageable level is a problem for the economy. Are we again sort of going for the symbolic tiding over current crisis or situation, to live another day but not to rectify our ways.
To an extent, it is to live another day, yes? Because what you are doing is, you're not addressing the fundamentals on the subsidies question. But yes, you are saying that I'm going to cut subsidies. Because the main burden of cuts would be on the subsidies. There is not much else to cut on. So out of that 39,000 crores, you probably will have to end up wheeling the axe on 25,000 crores on subsidies itself, which means fertilizer subsidies and oil subsidies. You have a program whereby you are increasing oil prices, which means that despite your going in for elections in 5 key states, including Delhi and Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, you probably will not stop your program of increasing petroleum prices during this period, which otherwise any government would probably be very, very tempted to do. So that's one. Yes, of course, you might be tempted not to increase it beyond the 50 paise or 1 rupee which you had been thinking of not doing that 5 rupee increase which you had talked of at one stage, but you will go in with at least the monicum of a cut because you want to keep your subsidy expenses down. Similarly, on fertilizers, you will try to work out systems whereby there is some kind of a cut in fertilizer subsidy. But this pause, which frankly this entire announcement on cutting down on expenditure is just a symptom. It's just one of the smaller medicines for the disease as a whole. Bigger window of opportunity which India has been given and most emerging economies has been given has been the US Fed's decision not to roll back stimulus which they had given out, which much of it, though it was meant for the US economy, has actually rolled over all over the world. Now this is an opportunity for us to change our ways in many ways. A, by trying to see to it that our foreign exchange reserves are not built on mere borrowings or even NRI deposits, which are also a form of borrowing, but positive trade balance. It is a time for us to see to it that import compression methods, logical import compression methods, but methods which actually hit consumption in India or hit, for that matter, domestic export activities, should be encouraged, encouraging our exports so that there is actually a positive trade surplus on the one hand, and on the other hand, a move to structurally change our economic situation so that we are not so dependent on subsidies in order to run this economy.
We have to look at the bigger problem. That is especially in an election year. How likely do you think it's going to happen? I mean, it is 8 months away from general elections and just a couple of months away from election in key states.
The reforms movement will continue. It will not gather pace. It will not be stepped upon, but there will be key reforms in the months up to the election. Despite the fact that in an election year, no government likes to tinker around with the economy, no government wants to go in for any kind of reforms, but because we are in a quicksand situation, this government will continue with the reforms and take the excuse of the quicksand situation in which we are stuck in to push those reforms. And they have the right to do so, and probably it might actually help them in elections if some results emanate from those reforms. You also know that if you don't reform, you'll still be damned. So it's better to reform and be damned. Or maybe get your way out of the place, the situation in which you are in.
You mentioned about the subsidy and cutting on fertilizer and oil. We just signed on for this other big expense, which is the food security bill. You will have a lot of people saying that, look, we were telling you, don't do it like this. Don't do it right now. We can't afford it. Of course, there are political reasons for doing the food security bill. But how does it work across in the book? Are we going to again be playing this little game of rearranging the pie so it looks neat? Hopefully some good things will come out. Because the thing you mentioned about reforms, it's a bit of a hope and a prayer. You're hoping government will continue taking reform measures. I'm talking about what has already happened.
Food subsidy bill is actually like a check which you're taking on the economy. You are not going to spend all the money that you want to or need to spend on the food subsidy bill this very year. You have just passed a bill for giving food at a certain price range. You will have to give it, undoubtedly. But right now, because you are not ready, you will not be able to give it, roll it all over the country. You will probably be able to roll it out in certain key districts. Your damage or your expenditure is actually limited. That's the first thing we have to realize. Second thing we have to realize is that it's actually a check which the next government, whoever it is, will have to bear. The second thing that we have to understand is that on the food bill, it is actually at the same time a kind of stimulus. Stimulus for the rural economy. If you subsidize food bills of most of the poor households in the rural areas, then they have some money which they can push into either savings or into further consumption. Either ways, it's going to help the economy. It's actually something which comes back rolls back into the economy. And secondly, we have to remember much of the food which if we hadn't sold off at rupees 2 and 3, which we are promising to sell off, would have rotted. So which would have been a great drain on the economy in itself. So consequently, the notional loss that to buy and then to store and sell a kilo of rice, you will probably need 8 rupee 50 paise or 11 rupee 90 paise or whatever the calculations are, and you are actually subsidizing it to the extent of 7 rupees does not work in this particular case, because much of the money would have anyway been wasted. If we take that, it's just like the oil, the bills, the notional amounts which ONGC and Indian Oil talk about of their losses, which are in many cases notional, because at least 20% of the crude is produced in India. 80% is of course imported, but 20% is produced, and the production costs haven't gone up in the last 5 or 6 years by a large amount, because most of their capital which they had invested is now zero rated.
Come back to the biggest component of our fiscal deficit, or our current account deficit really, is oil. About this increase in oil prices, it may not happen at the rate at which it needs to happen, because after all, no government is suicidal, but it will happen. Are we addressing that big component of our problem, which is oil?
Let's understand this, that we will be oil dependent in years to come. There's no way we can avoid it. We do not, even if we go in and even if we offer the best and most attractive terms to oil explorers, we will not be able to find the kind of oil that we need to use. Our usage of oil is actually going to increase. It's not going to decline. It's not going to remain static. And whatever discoveries we might make will not be enough to satisfy our needs. So our craving for oil will continue, which is why for the last 10 to 15 years we have been trying to buy oil equity abroad. We have not been very successful, but we have been marginally successful in certain areas. Some amount of oil will start flowing in from the fields where we have bought oil equity. In fact, our security paradigm will have to change consequently. We will probably be forced to become more of a naval power rather than be a land power that we are today, in order to protect our oil equity investments abroad and to bring that oil back home. That's one part of the system. The other is, which we should have done when we were on top of the world, when champagne bottles were being broken, when they were talking about India as an emerging power. That is the time when we should have quietly pushed for rupee trade in a larger number of areas, larger number of relationships that we had. We did not do it. Now we want to do rupee trade. It's a little difficult to push at this point of time, excepting perhaps with Iran, where again we have a problem, because Iran does not buy enough from us, and we do not want to sell too much to Iran, because the companies which produce things which Iran might need, tractors or cars, do not want to sell it to Iran, simply because Iran, if they sell it to Iran, then they attract all kinds of sanctions from the West. We can, of course, follow the Israeli lead. By the way, Israel also trades with Iran, despite its political differences with Iran, of forming a state trading corporation exclusively for Iran and channelizing whatever Iran wants, from soap to tractors to power machinery, power gear, through that trading corporation. Otherwise, our rupee balance with Iran will continue increasing, and there will be great difficulty for Iran to liquidate it. Iran will face the same problem that Russia faced with their huge amount of rupees which they carried over from the arms trade that they had with us through the 70s and 80s.
Joseph, what should the government do next? Because this is truly a problem. It's a problem that visits us.
Let's be very clear, Urmi, that the government has its vision is more or less is fixed, and it's not on the wrong path. It's just that they have to do it much more quickly and better. Yes, they have to buy oil equity more from abroad. Yes, they have to go in for rupee trade more. Yes, they have to increase exports and compress imports. Now, these are given, which the government has understood and the government is acting on. Yes, they have been slow in doing so for this long, but this pause which has been given to them by Bernanke, by the US Fed, and that is the time when they have to go in for this. And yes, the measures which were announced last night of limiting the size of government, of not creating new jobs, has to be continued for a longer period of time. Government has to be lean and trim and mean in its spending.
Thank you so much for giving us an insight as to what the Finance Ministry has been up to. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on austerity measures to contain fiscal deficit. The participants were Jayanta Roy Chaudhary, The Telegraph, and Urmi Goswami, economic journalist. It came to you in the program News Analysis, produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website, news.air.nic.in. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.